Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I'm Paul Johnson, Director of the IFS, and I'm delighted to introduce this webinar on pension policy, which comes at the end of a two-year research series of research projects we've been carrying out here at the IFS, very kindly supported by a group of organisations some of whom are represented among the speakers this afternoon, which has really looked at some of the key questions, I think, for pension policy at the moment and going forward. In a minute, you're going to hear Rowena Crawford, my colleague, who's Associate Director here, who will be talking about what's happened to savings behaviour, to retirement expectations, who's opted out of auto-enrolment, what's happened to the pension savings of the self-employed, what are the links between housing and pension savings, some of the absolutely key questions in pension policy at the moment. But before Rowena speaks, I'm delighted to be able to introduce Guy Opperman, who of course you'll all know as Minister of Pensions and Financial Inclusion, who reminded us that actually spoke for us about 2.5 years ago at a live event, and it's great actually to have a pensions minister who's been in post I think for about 3.5 years now, and is really pushing forward some of these issues that we're discussing. And I'm particularly delighted that DWP are among the sponsors of the work that we're going to have presented by Rowena. After Rowena, we'll have a small panel with Carolyn Jones from the Money and Pension Service and Andrew Tully from Canada Life speaking for a few minutes each. Both the Money and Pension Service and Canada Life have also helped support this. We'll then have plenty of time for questions. The Minister has to disappear fairly quickly. He's duty minister at DWP at the moment with a very busy diary, but it is just possible that I might be able to squeeze a question or two in after he's finished speaking. And if you do have questions for any of the speakers, do put them on Slido. But with no further ado from me, Minister, please go ahead.
So thank you, Paul. It is a great honour and a privilege to be speaking to the IFS. I looked it up, it was on the 12th of June 2018 when I last gave a live discussion speech Q&A to the IFS, and it was something that I particularly enjoyed. And I want to make a particular thanks to the way in which the IFS genuinely engage with pension policy. I wish other think tanks did more and provided the sort of searching questions and queries and in-depth research that you guys are doing. Clearly, we are living in unprecedented times, and as you know, obviously the government's priorities would be beating COVID, the plan for jobs, obviously building back better, and supporting people to save for retirement in the longer term. And I would hope that our work with pensions policy is a cornerstone of that. Paul is right that I have done this job now for just in excess of 3.5 years. And after the last election, which I think the anniversary of which is on Saturday, someone said to me, I don't know whether to congratulate you on being reappointed as the pensions minister or commiserate with you. And I very genuinely responded and said, look, this is a job I asked to do in the first place. It's a job I really enjoy. Any job where you're making 30 to 40 year policy, where your budget, my state pension budget and the state budget is effectively 120 billion. Private pensions, clearly I have overall control over, subject to regulation, but that's trillions of pounds. But the impact and trying to get this country match fit for the future, it seems to me, is very, very, very important and a great honour and privilege to do this job. I should welcome the findings of the IFS. I confess that I have only glanced through the report on a single occasion. I haven't done the sort of deep dive into it that I hope to do so. I suspect it'll be on everybody's Christmas card list for some weighty reading. But I know that the key part of the research involves understanding the trends in pension savings and the completion of mortgage repayments. Clearly, paying off one's mortgage is a significant milestone, but I note that the report finds that despite mortgage expenditures falling by over £200 per person, there is little change in average pension saving. there is a clear need to increase individuals' understanding of the value of pension saving. To help with this, we're introducing measures that will allow people to understand what they have in their pension pots and allow savers to feel supported in making the right decisions for retirement. I read with interest the findings related to the impact of house prices on the pensions membership of young adults. The government is genuinely committed to supporting people of all incomes to save for their retirement and have access to affordable, secure housing. The research indicates and discusses the impact of automatic enrolment and the interactions between owner occupation and pension savings. And it is widely accepted that automatic enrolment has been a tremendous success on a cross-party basis and has transformed the way people save for their retirement. The numbers themselves, as we all know, are impressive. Since 2012, over 10 million employees have been automatically enrolled into a workplace pension by over 1.7 million employers. And I should pause by saying, A, my Wi-Fi at home is not brilliant. B, the barking in the background is the small puppy that is beginning to play up, who may make an appearance shortly at this rate. And C, I have the builders next door who are trying to impress us all with their drilling capability. So my apologies for any disruptions that occur in the next 10 or 15 minutes. And I accept that the puppy is what everybody wants to see. So let me go back to what I was trying to say. So it is vital that we maintain the success of AE and build upon that. And one of my jobs, it seems to me, in 2021, having got automatic enrolment to 8% and having managed to weather automatic enrolment through the COVID difficulties, is to relook at automatic enrolment and decide what it is that we're going to do. And we are doing that in a number of different ways. But our focus clearly remains on strengthening long-term savings behaviour. We want to expand the coverage of these successful reforms and increase the amounts that are being put into retirement savings by millions of working people. As with all areas of public policy, we will pay close attention to the impact and costs of making changes and consider the optimal approach to implementation. Now, I'm keen that our plan for pensions reaches every worker across the country. I welcome the research released earlier in October on retirement savings of the self-employed. More broadly, I'm working on sidecar savings, which we'll come into in a bit more detail, financial resilience, financial inclusion, and how we can create a rainy day fund so that everybody has savings set aside on an ongoing basis. Clearly, the self-employed and the sidecar savings go together, and the work that we've done and the trials that have been tested. And I look forward to seeing more detail on that going forward. I want to briefly touch on the sort of government's priorities for pensions and financial inclusion. We want people across the country to be able to tap into and seize the benefits of greater financial access. Regardless of background, income, race, colour, creed, we want people to have the ability to access financial services and the products that are right for them. From the basic necessity of being able to open a bank account to being offered affordable credit, insurance, and suitable mortgage products. Being financially included is a fundamental thread which needs to run between and through people's lives. That's why I believe that tackling financial inclusion through our policy making has been a key priority for this government and remains high on the agenda. And I'll pause and just make the point here that I'm the first Minister for Pensions and Financial Inclusion. And it's a job that I pitched to the then Deputy Prime Minister Damien Green and the then Prime Minister Theresa May, because I felt that financial inclusion was absolutely fundamental to the way in which this country should be seen in the 2020s and going forward. And I genuinely feel that tying it onto this job has been a massive success. It has widened the portfolio and it has changed the dynamic within the department. We have a long way to go, but the Financial Inclusion Policy Forum, which I co-chair with John Glenn, the EST, brings together leaders on financial inclusion so that all sectors work together and provide strategic leadership in tackling financial exclusion. And we've recently done an annual report, again, very good Christmas reading, I can assure you, but it talks about how we're supporting people on their financial journeys, whether that's through the announcement of additional funding to scale up access to affordable credit, encouragement of fair and responsible behaviours from service providers, improvement to people's financial capability and resilience. And you look at the work we've done on mid-cost credit and high-cost credit. You look at the work that we've done, whether it is expanding basic bank accounts. You look at the work that we've done with the dormant assets funds. You look at the work that we've done in respect of access to finance. And I genuinely believe that we are making slow but steady and really significant strides on this issue. I can't not talk about the pension schemes bill. They say with pensions that you wait ages and ages for legislation, and then two come along at once, just like buses. And so we obviously did the Social Security uprating bill in the autumn, and throughout this year we have done the pension schemes bill. Now, the pension schemes bill is, I've got the grey hair coming through very strongly to prove it, has been over 2 years worth of work, and I am really proud of it. It is presently with their lordships to decide if they want to engage in ping pong, but the bottom line is it has passed the House of Lords, passed the House of Commons, and just needs its final validation. It does work, whether it is, the creation of collective defined contributions, which builds upon the work we're doing on super funds as an alternative product. It creates and makes the legislation for dashboard. It does all the work to protect against scams that are such a problem for the elderly and all of our grandparents and parents. And it tackles the behavior that we feel that is incorrect and inappropriate, particularly in respect of some pension schemes, building upon the BHS inquiry and all the work that's done, and gives greater powers to the regulator on an ongoing basis. It is 200 pages, it's 130 clauses, it's something I'm very, very proud of. And it is genuinely something I think that we should be celebrating, because it is also, for the first time, it puts climate change and pensions hand in partnership. Now, there are many things that could be improved with this country, like with all countries. But if you look at our record on climate change, and this is over successive governments, it is, in my view, something that we should be fantastically proud about. Putting it bluntly, though, in the pension space, first country to legislate for net zero out of the G7 by 2050. We absolutely lead the way in ESG in the whole of Europe. There's no question in my mind. I'm reminded that I did an event with Goldman Sachs in February, just before lockdown. And it was discussing ESG and how we were going to expand upon ESG to do the task force on climate-related financial disclosures. Now, normally when the pensions minister speaks at events, there's maybe 50 to 100 people. They were literally queuing outside the door, and we could not fit everybody in to talk about ESG. It has transformed the City of London. It is totally changed the dynamic between pension trustees, pension funds, and the City of London. And it's an opportunity. My Lord, it's an opportunity. This country can lead the way in terms of climate-related investment and ESG, and the investments that we make, and also in things like housing. We have now enabled pension funds to invest in a great deal more detail, a great more capability in things like illiquids. And I see no reason why pension schemes should not look at their liquid investments, and whether that is investing in a wind farm on its own, rather than just buying a stake in it, or looking at housing. There's no question a pension scheme could create social housing based upon a housing association model, or retirement housing based upon exactly the same model that's pre-existing. So we're trying to let people do that. There's also other things I could talk about. The Nest Insight Sidecar Savings Trial, which is something that we've worked on for many years and are very supportive of. It's clearly there to try and build up emergency savings through payroll deduction. And I'm really looking at both Sidecar and how it particularly works. And we'll be making decisions on trying to do what we're going to do with that going forward after the trial is completed, but also how we create separate savings accounts for individuals so that they have the rainy day money going forward. I could talk in more detail about other things in the bill, but I hope you are all aware of that. But I'm certainly conscious of the fact that the UK is the first country in the world to require climate risks to be specifically considered by a pension scheme. And I continue to make the case that whilst we should make climate and pensions work hand in hand. We are not a divestment country. We are not in the business of saying anything other than the partnership to get us to net zero has to be done with business. And those who seek to promote divestment, who seek to breach fiduciary duty, to mandate things which would have an inevitable consequence, we reject that approach totally. We need to empower trustees, have good stewardship, and work with businesses as they evolve onto a net zero pathway. I'm nearly done, but I will make a couple of final points. If you haven't got into detail in what the Treasury are doing in working with us, whether that is the TCFD roadmap, which was announced by the Chancellor on the 9th of November, or the Green Gilt, which we've been calling for a great deal of time, which provides an opportunity for investment in all manner of potential things, from new nuclear to hydrogen to carbon capture to expanded solar and wind farms, then I think the Green Gilt is absolutely, and how it is shaped and what it's going to be is going to be key. All of which builds up to COP26 in November next year in Glasgow, which we believe at DWP we are going to be a key part of. Most importantly, we as the United Kingdom are leading the way in so much in respect of those matters. So I thank you for the work that you've done. I look forward to working with the IFS. It's a fantastic organisation that has a very different approach and something that we welcome. And I love the fact, putting it bluntly, that you're interested in pensions. So thanks very, very much indeed for your time.
Well, thank you ever so much. That was a fantastic introduction to this event. If you do have a minute,
I've got about 5 minutes.
5 minutes. That's fantastic. It'd be great just to sort of maybe have a little bit of a discussion about one or two of the things that you raised. I'm actually really interested in what you said about how being Minister for Pensions and Financial Inclusion has really changed the way in which you and the department do things. And I just wonder if you'd like to say a little bit more about how that's changed the culture and what you think is different as a result of that change in focus and title.
Oh, so we're on a journey, there's no question. DWP is effectively 2 to 3 parts. It's the Ministry for UC. It is also dealing with, obviously, PIP and disability and all of that, but that's the main part of DWP. Then there is the traditional pensions part, divided in two to private pensions and state pensions. But everything we do, it relates to long-term savings, it relates to financial resilience, it relates to looking after the most vulnerable in society. And it seems to me that financial inclusion is actually what we do already, but it's just trying to make the department understand and get a grasp of that. And then looking at the policy levers, not all of which are in my portfolio, but clearly are in Treasury or in other organisations, the policy levers that you can pull to make a difference. And it's quite clear that for the first time, Treasury and DWP are working hand in hand. Great credit to John Glenn, my colleague at Treasury. He and I have worked really closely on this because the two departments do most of this portfolio. And whilst I'm the Minister for Financial Inclusion, he deals with things like basic bank accounts. He deals with things like how you regulate high cost credit. And trying to get those two things working together, it seems to me, is very good. The Policy Forum has made a real difference. And I think it also allows a degree of critical thinking of the department, because there's a danger in all departments, anyone who's worked in government knows, there's a danger that everybody gets very much in their silo, and it's how they've always done it. But making pensions something wider and bigger than just pure state or private pensions has unquestionably changed the department's outlook, and they are being forced from the PermSec to the directors downwards to look at financial resilience and financial inclusion in a very different way. And I think it's a good thing. I would, like all ministers, I'd love us to be galloping towards I've gone into jockey mode now. So I've been resolving all matters very quickly, and that's not possible. You have to consult and look at policy and get a team together, and it takes a while. But I'm no doubt whatsoever that financial resilience and inclusion is now front and centre as part of this government in a way it just never was before Theresa made that decision.
That's really fascinating.
And we'd welcome your help as well.
Well, we'll do what we can. Just one last question, which I guess also relates to this, is the longer term change, and something which I don't think you're expecting to change the world overnight. But I'm really interested in as we have the IFS for quite a long time in the collective money purchase scheme part of the pension schemes bill, and I suppose what are your hopes and expectations for that in terms of how that might change behaviour
Sure.
and culture in among employers providing pensions, and over what period and what do you think success might look like?
So to me, it's really simple. So if you're a conservative, you value choice, okay? And you also want to find solutions to problems. So I approach this from between the PPF and an insurance buyout, there wasn't really any other alternative, and there's no choice. And no disrespect to the ABI, very esteemed and worthy organization, but they have effectively got a closed shop because they run the insurance buyout. And it's a very expensive closed shop as well. So there is a gap in the market. So what government has tried to do is to create two alternative products to fill that gap. The one is collective defined contributions, collective money purchases, whatever you want to call them. Now, I looked really long and hard at it. I spent about 6 months sitting down. It was one of the first things I did as minister. Met with a bunch of think tanks, spoke to people, sat down with the CWU and Royal Mail, who were obviously at the front of the queue on this. And it seemed to me that why would government not create this and give the opportunity? And because there is no doubt that there are significant organizations that in the main, there will be the large ones to start with, but there'll be perfectly possible to be smaller ones as well going forward. And we've drafted the legislation so that it's not just Royal Mail focused. But there are significant organizations who will look at this and say, between DB and DC, this is a hybrid middle ground model that we all can live with. I think it particularly applies where there is enlightened and positive and pragmatic unions who see that this is an opportunity for the union to be really involved, and the community that is a union and that is that cooperative spirit can work very well together. And there's no doubt that the full credit to the CWU, they've embraced this. And you can see how it is working, so that instead of it being a DB or the DC nature of it, which is very much you're on your own, there is a cooperative, there is a pragmatic and a collective approach to this that they really feel they can work. We think, learnt the lessons from the problems they had in Holland, and I genuinely believe there will be a significant number of organizations who will be looking at CDCs on an ongoing basis. I also touched briefly on super funds, because again, super funds, which have been tried elsewhere, and again, in my view, are very much the way ahead, provide an alternative product to an insurance buyout. It is not as good as an insurance buyout. Everyone gets that. And obviously, if you can get to insurance buyout, good luck to you. But between these two gaps, why wouldn't you have an alternative product which, properly regulated and properly looked after, provides an alternative and a better outcome for members? Because that's all we're interested in, is a better outcome for members, and protecting the PPF, I think, as well, is the other key point. So what I'm very proud of, and CDCs is pretty much over the line. We will have to do secondary regulation, and that will take a little while. But it's, we're pretty much ready to go. This is a set of policies we genuinely have got behind. Super funds, we're not as far as down the track, and I have to do primary legislation on that. The bottom line is we have interim regulation, and we did the interim regulation in the middle of COVID after huge amounts of work, and a hat tip to the TPR and others who really made this work. But clearly there was an unregulated process taking place, which we needed to regulate, even if only in interim form. So that will happen at some stage, I hope by way of primary legislation, although that's a little difficult. But it seems to me you get choice, you get a better outcome for members, and it is a very conservative thing that you're shaking up a market.
That's great. Thanks. I know you have to. I know you have to go. I mean, that really was quite an inspiring introduction to what we're doing this afternoon. So thank you for that. And it really will. You know, I really am. You know, also quite excited to find out how much changes as a result of the things you've just described, in particular these CDCs, which I know the department's been working on for a very long time, and you know, where I think we all agree there is a gap in the market and something to be done. And
we'll change a lot. Listen, I must go. Thank you very much indeed.
Fantastic.
Thank you one and all. Much appreciated.
Well, thank you again to the Minister there. We're now going to move on with the rest of the event, and I'm going to hand over directly, as I said, to Rowena Crawford, who is Associate Director at the IFS and runs our work on pensions, and she's going to be presenting in brief the results of the 2 years of work which have gone into the work of the Pensions Consortium, and then, as I say, Andrew Tully and Carolyn Jones will speak briefly as part of a panel before we go to questions from you all. And do put questions on Slido as we go along. But
thank you very much, Paul, for that introduction. So yes, I'm going to summarise the work that we've been doing over the last couple of years in this space, which entitles pension saving in a world of personal responsibility. And I'm sure many of you are aware of that, but just to give you a sense of the context of this, the pensions landscape has been changing for many decades, but also particularly over the last decade. And there are lots of trends and reforms been going on. Obviously, the continued decline of defined benefit pensions, the move to a flat rate state pension system where the pension you get from the government isn't going to be related to the amount of earnings you had during working life, and increasing longevity, meaning that people, even with increases in the state pension age, tended to spend an increasing proportion of their life in retirement. And all of these changes are really leading to a shift in responsibility for securing good retirement outcomes onto individuals themselves. There's less being done for them by their employer or the structure of an employer pension scheme. The state isn't going to be providing a pension that gives any sort of earnings related replacement in retirement. It's really up to individuals themselves to decide how much to save for retirement and when to do that. And there's a long running concern that individuals either can't or won't rise to that responsibility. And that's what's really prompted the development and the introduction of automatic enrolment, which is very much designed to nudge people in the right direction. But as fantastically successful as automatic enrolment has been at increasing participation in private pensions, it's only a blanket nudge. So it's not necessarily right for everybody. Particularly, there are many people for whom saving 8%, say, of their earnings into a pension all through working life won't give them enough in retirement to smooth their living standards. But at the other end of the spectrum, there are people for whom saving 8% of their current income for the future might actually be too much saving. They would benefit more from that income now. So it's not necessarily right for everybody, as ever, with something that's kind of a blanket policy. And then there, of course, there are groups of people not covered by automatic enrolment at all, most notably the self-employed, for whom there isn't an employer to kind of nudge them into saving on their behalf. So that's the context in which we've devised and we've been doing this research program over the last couple of years, exploring various aspects of people's attitudes and their pension savings behaviour in that context. And as Paul said, we are very grateful to the members of the IFS Retirement Savings Consortium, both for funding this work, because frankly, without that, the research wouldn't happen, but also for the really valuable insights and the variety of viewpoints that we've had along the way in helping us to interpret what we're finding and think about the directions that we take the research. So obviously they're listed on the screen, but for those of you that can't see the slides or are just listening in, we're extremely grateful to Age UK, the Association of British Insurers, Aviva, Canada Life, Chartered Insurance Institute, Department for Work and Pensions, the Investment Association, Legal and General Investment Management, the Money and Pension Service, and the Economic and Social Research Council. So what have we found over the last couple of years? What have we done? Well, to sum it up in one sentence, I think the big picture is that most people, not everybody, but most people really are alert when it comes to their pension saving, which is a large part, actually, I guess, of the success of automatic enrolment. And this is a theme. I mean, we've obviously looked at this in lots of different cases. It's a theme that comes through in many different ways in many different settings. There's kind of 4 strands to the research that we've done. And I'll give you a kind of nugget of the highlights here, and then I'll talk about each in slightly more detail. So first, we've looked at how people's attitudes have evolved over the 2010s, a period when there have been quite a lot of reforms, a lot of advertisements of pensions issues in the media. And we found that an awful lot of attitudes really haven't changed very much over that period. The one big exception is that people are planning to retire later. We've looked at automatic enrolment. Obviously, few people leave their pension after being automatically enrolled. It's been very successful at increasing membership. And what we've looked at is what characteristics are associated with people who have or haven't decided to leave. And little explains actually why the people that leave the pension have chosen to do so. And that has some important concerns wrapped up in it that I'll come back to. Third, we've looked at the interactions between saving in pensions and saving for owner-occupied housing, which is a really important issue that I think has been really understudied, particularly important at the moment when we have rapidly increasing house prices and well-documented issues of younger generations in particular struggling to get on the housing ladder, and at the same time trying to encourage people to save more for their retirement. So there's a kind of interesting tension to some extent in those decisions. And then finally, as was touched on already, the self-employed are a really important group, amongst whom private pension saving has collapsed over the last couple of decades. And what we found is that actually that's not just to do with the composition of the self-employed, it's a striking feature amongst the relatively higher income and longer term self-employed for whom this is actually more of a concern. So I'll now tell you a little bit about each of these in slightly more detail, but given the kind of time constraints of virtual events, how long we can all spend sitting in front of the computer, this really will be the kind of nugget highlights. So if any of these are interesting you, I would recommend you have a look on our website where the full reports or shorter blog pieces summarising the findings are available. So first off, our work looking at attitudes. What we've done here is compare responses about people's attitudes and their expectations that have been consistently asked over the period 2006 to 2018 and looked at how people's responses to these questions have changed. And what we found is that despite the number of reforms, increases in the state pension age, new state pension, all of these big policy changes that have got lots of traction in the media, there's really little evidence of much change in a lot of kind of fundamental attitudes. People's self-reported understanding of pensions hasn't changed very much. People's preferences for today versus the future or now versus retirement really haven't changed very much. We do see that more individuals are expecting to receive private pension income in retirement as a result of automatic enrolment. And that's not as obvious as it might first seem at first sight. It's slightly more subtle than that. What that suggests is that automatic enrolment isn't just bringing people into pension saving sooner. So if it increases pension saving amongst people in their 20s or 30s, these aren't people that we're going to expect to save at a private pension at some point. They're just doing it sooner. What this suggests is that automatic enrolment is really increasing the proportion of people that are ever going to save in private pension. We also see that confidence in retirement adequacy has improved over this decade, but it doesn't seem to be that's because of automatic enrolment improving people's retirement savings and therefore improving what they think they're going to get. It seems to be driven just by improvements in income, recovery from the financial crisis, and general consumer confidence going up. And in fact, if you look at the levels, only about half of people are confident in the adequacy of their retirement income. So taken at face value, there's quite a bit of concern still about how prepared people are going to be financially when they come to stop work. As I said, the one thing that has changed in a striking way is people's planned retirement ages. So this graph shows you people's expected retirement age amongst people aged 40 to 54 back in 2006-8, with men on the left and women on the right. Men very much expected to retire at age 65, women a bit more evenly split between 60 and 65. If we spin on 10 years, similarly aged men and women are expecting to retire on average much later. And in particular, there are big clusters of people expecting to retire at age 67, which is the state pension age for this group. Now, that's not guaranteed to happen. I mean, the state pension age is a very focal age, but you can choose to retire before the state pension age and finance yourself. You can choose to retire afterwards and either continue working whilst claiming a state pension or defer potentially getting the state pension income. But it very much looks like there's a big signal associated with the state pension age, particularly towards the end of this period when I think the state pension age is more salient in terms of the fact that it's gone up, it's increased from its 60, 65 level that it used to be. And that seems to be what's driving people's expectations here. In terms of automatic enrolment, as I said, we've looked at this in some detail, and this is a graph you'll all be very familiar with. This shows you automatic enrolment boosting private pension membership, particularly amongst private sector employees, since 2012. So now only a minority of eligible employees leaving a pension after being automatically enrolled. And we've looked at the characteristics associated with that, essentially trying to answer the question, are the right, quote unquote, people choosing to leave the pension and the right people choosing to stay in? And what we've found is that automatic enrolment hasn't just massively increased pension membership rates, but it's also really equalised them across individuals with different characteristics and different circumstances. So this graph gives you one illustration. This shows you pension participation by age. And the black line is before automatic enrolment, when there was quite an age profile in pension participation. People in prime working age much more likely to be in a pension than employees in their early 20s or their late 20s and early 30s. After automatic enrolment, that's much flatter. There's very little difference across different age groups and the proportion of people in pension. And it's interesting to ask what's driving that, because automatic enrolment involves a number of different features. Obviously, there's the automatic enrolment aspect of it. There's the being defaulted into a pension. But there's also the fact that automatic enrolment has made pensions much more widespread across employers. It's much more likely you're going to be explicitly offered a pension in this way. And employers are obliged to make a financial contribution. So there's also much greater financial incentive to join a pension after automatic enrolment than there was for a lot of people before automatic enrolment. So it's interesting to try and think about what the relative contribution of those different mechanisms, those different incentives might be. And one way we've kind of had a first stab at doing that is by comparing, if we look at people before automatic enrolment, those who were offered a private pension, what was pension membership amongst that group look like? And that's shown by the yellowy orange line here. And what that shows is amongst people offered a pension, membership was much higher, but it still has this age kind of profile. You still get differences across people with different circumstances. So that really suggests that if the automatic enrolment policy, if what it did was it increased pension availability and made them as relatively generous, say, as they were before automatic enrolment, maybe we would expect higher coverage, but we would still expect differences by age. What seems to happen is, obviously, after automatic enrolment, it's much more flat. So it looks like it's the default mechanism, which is what is driving particular groups who are less likely to join a pension before automatic enrolment to be just as likely to be in a pension after automatic enrolment. And I've shown you this by age. Actually, if you look across any number of individual characteristics or circumstances, you get a similar thing. Pension coverage really doesn't differ very much after automatic enrolment. And one particular issue there is you also find a similar effect when you look at how financially secure people are. So what we have done is we've divided people into kind of groups according to their financial security. More details in the paper, but it's taking into account things like household income, individual earnings, whether or not people have liquid savings, their material deprivation, whether they have long-standing health conditions that limit their activities. And if you look at before automatic enrolment, the least financially secure groups were much less likely to be in a pension, whereas the most financially secure, much more likely. After automatic enrolment, that's flat, and you've got very high levels of pension membership amongst those groups that are not financially secure. Now, I don't want to detract too much from the success of automatic enrolment because there's a relatively small proportion of employees that fall into those financial security groups. We're taking the bottom two groups, for example, that's about 12% of private sector employees. But it's really striking that even amongst these groups who potentially might benefit more from having higher income today, taking home more of their earnings as take-home pay, rather than saving it for the future. Even amongst those groups, automatic enrolment is still being very successful in increasing pension membership. So I think there is a policy question there for automatic enrolment 2.0. As it's been discussed, is maybe we do need to think a little bit about whether the default is too strong for some people, and whether there are tweaks that could be made around the edges, either to make the opt-out possibility slightly more salient or maybe more targeted communications. So I don't want to advocate particular policy reforms at this stage, but you could think about things like if someone's behind on a council tax bill, they could receive a targeted communication that reminds them that they're potentially opted into a pension scheme, and if they wanted to opt out, here's how they could do that. So tweaks like that around the edges that might make automatic enrolment even more successful than it is at the moment. So the third strand that I talked about is thinking about the interactions between saving in a pension and saving for owner-occupied housing. And these two assets are the most important forms of wealth that most individuals accumulate. In terms of the proportion of 50 to 59-year-olds that have these assets, about 2/3 are owner-occupiers and about 80% now, nearly 80% have a private pension. So they're very, very common assets, and an awful lot of wealth is held in these two forms. But of course, deciding how much to accumulate in each of these forms and when to do so, so when to start saving a pension, how much to contribute, when to buy a house, how big a house to buy, they're really difficult decisions. You have to think about the relative financial return and what your pension's invested in versus the capital gain on housing, your own preferences for housing versus other goods and services, both now and potentially in the future, the risks associated with different assets, the tax incentives to save in a pension, employer contributions versus tax incentives or other government incentives to save for owner-occupied housing. And of course, that's compounded by the fact that both these assets are relatively illiquid. If you put money in a pension, you can't get it out again until you're 55. If you put lots of money in buying a property, you can't easily access that without remortgaging or moving. And there are big fixed costs involved there. So these are really difficult decisions about how much to save in these two different forms and when. And I think we know relatively little, actually. I think it's very understudied about how the timing of these two things interact. So we've made a first attempt to think about some of these issues. There's far more that can be done, but two aspects that we have looked at is for younger adults, how house prices might affect the decision of whether or not to join a pension. The idea being that the higher house prices are, the more that you potentially save in for a deposit, and therefore the less likely you might want to be to join a pension at this stage. And then for older adults, looking at people finishing repaying their mortgages and asking what happens to pension saving at that point. So taking the first of those first, I mean, what we've found is that actually high house prices, perhaps surprisingly, only reduce pension membership very slightly amongst young adults. And that's even before automatic enrolment, when, as we've just described, pension saving is much more kind of default driven. Looking at the estimated effect, if we divide employees according to how the level of their earnings, we estimate that £150,000 higher local house price, so that's roughly the increase in the average house price between 1997 and 2007. That much higher house prices only leads to about 3 in 100 people in the middle of the earnings distribution not saving as a pension as a result. So there's a relatively small effect. And this kind of U-shaped pattern with earnings is what you'd expect if you think that higher earning people are probably able to afford both to save in a pension and to purchase a property at the same time. Lower earning people probably less likely to be saving in a pension or less likely to be buying a house regardless. It's those people in the middle of the earnings distribution who are perhaps feeling the most credit constrained by the need to save in both those two forms. So there is an effect, but it's a relatively small one. Just quickly, we've also looked at how that differs between workers in the public and the private sector. And perhaps somewhat surprising at first sight, what we found is the effect is bigger amongst the public sector than amongst the private sector, which in a way is surprising because the public sector you're offered a relatively generous pension scheme, and in a way you're leaving money on the table if in terms of your employer contribution if you don't join that pension as soon as you're eligible to do so. But what I think is going on there, and that's supported by looking at differences within the public sector between different public sector schemes, is that, of course, to join a public sector pension scheme, most of the time you have to make individual contributions, and they're relatively high in some cases, particularly compared to the private sector. So maybe it's just the fact that these credit constraints might bite more in the public sector, that to join the pension, you have to make relatively high employee contributions, and if you're busy squirreling away money or saving money to try and purchase a property, that could be more of a constraint. But even within the public sector and even within middle earners in the public sector, this effect is still relatively small. At the other end of kind of housing life cycle, if you like, people finishing paying their mortgage could increase their pension contributions at that time without a fall in their living standards. If you're used to paying £400 to your bank every month and then you don't have to do that anymore, you could quite easily pay £400 into your pension fund without really any change in the amount of other goods and services and fun things you could be doing. So this seems like a really attractive, intuitive thing that people might behave in this way. What we've done is we've looked at workers that's aged 54 to the state pension age who finished paying off their mortgage. And amongst this group, average monthly mortgage repayments are about £400 per household, £200 per person. But people really don't seem to behave in this way. Only about 5% of people increase their pension contributions by more than £150 a month at the point they finish paying off their mortgage. So it doesn't look like people are kind of leveraging this opportunity in this way. So we think that's quite an interesting policy that people might want to be considered going forward. So if we want to encourage people to save more for retirement, particularly relatively well-off people, it could well be the point that people pay off their mortgage is a nice teachable moment to try and nudge people to save more. And if a big problem is this is well established in the literature, people are really prepared to save more. They just want to do so tomorrow. If that's a problem, maybe it's even possible to get people to pre-commit to boosting their pension saving at the point they pay off their mortgage to overcome that problem as well. So this could be a really effective way, I think, to try and influence behaviour. Finally, self-employed. So this is a graph, or it's a feature that many of you are probably familiar with. The last 2 decades have seen a really significant decline in the proportion of the self-employed contributing to a private pension. Back in 2000, that was relatively similar between self-employed and private sector employees. Since then, pension membership amongst both groups have declined, but most dramatically amongst the self-employed. And of course, from 2012 onwards, automatic enrolment dramatically reversed that trend for private sector employees, and that hasn't happened for self-employed people. So fewer than 1 in 5 self-employed are now saving in a private pension. And what we've done in this work is try and unpick to what extent that might be explainable by the fact that the composition of the self-employed population has changed over this period. Earnings are lower, and we've got more self-employed people that are relatively transitory self-employed. Maybe we would expect pension saving to be much lower just because of that composition effects. But actually, the work we've done suggests that's not really a particularly important driver of what's been going on. That only explains a minority of this trend. And actually, if you look at particular groups, so here I'm showing you the proportion of the self-employed contributing to a private pension for different bands of earnings and for different amounts of time spent in self-employment. And what you can see is that it's those groups that used to be much more likely to save a pension, the relatively higher income self-employed and the relatively long-term self-employed, amongst whom the declines in pension participation have been greatest. And that's potentially actually more of a concern, I think, than the general decline in pension saving amongst the self-employed, because it's these groups, the relatively high earners. I mean, these aren't necessarily rich people by any means, because the self-employed as a population tend to earn less than employees on average. But these sorts of levels of earnings would put you well into AE territory, higher end of the spectrum. These are the individuals who would benefit most from having private pension coverage, because the state pension is going to give them less in terms of earnings replacement in retirement. And those that have been in self-employment for longer are less likely to have long periods of work spent as employees during which they might be building up private pension lives. So it's these groups amongst whom we really expect they might benefit from saving in a private pension, and therefore for whom the decline over the last couple of decades is most concerning. And we've done some work, which I won't go into in the interest of time, trying to unpick what might be going on here. And it doesn't seem that there's much evidence of real strong attitudinal shifts against pensions amongst the self-employed. And it's really not obvious that they're saving in other forms to offset these trends either. So I think there is more work to be done, both understanding this and thinking about what can we do about it. So where do we go from here? Well, I think there's 4 big policy issues going forward. So there's probably more than 4. There's 4 that I would in particular like to highlight. One has already been touched on, is that automatic enrolment. How can we build on this to ensure adequate retirement incomes when there's research that shows that for many people, 8% contributions over the whole of working life might not be enough. In particular, how can pension saving be increased amongst the self-employed for whom automatic enrolment can't act as a nudge into pension saving? Somewhat going against those 2 questions, there's also the real concern about how can we square the need for more pension saving amongst particular groups with concerns about low liquid financial savings as well. And I think that's been brought into particular sharp relief by the current pandemic and the effects of that on people's incomes and living standards. It's really highlighted the important role that liquid financial savings can play at smoothing shocks that people might face. And then finally, not something I've talked a huge amount about yet so far, but how can individuals be supported to get the most benefit from the new pension flexibilities? That's an extremely important issue going forwards as well. And just to summarise what our research that we've done over the last couple of years suggests in these areas, as I've said, I think one really exciting potential option for encouraging greater pension saving in future is to think about moments when that might be relatively easy for individuals and relatively salient to target. So, for example, we've highlighted targeting policies at people completing repaying their mortgage. That looks like a good nudge point that people aren't really leveraging them at the moment. You could make similar arguments perhaps about future graduates paying off their student loans. Maybe that's a good point to try and encourage greater pension saving as well. In terms of the self-employed, I think what I would stress is that we really want to be targeting policies to increase pension saving, not necessarily just across the board, all self-employed people, but really targeting those for whom pension saving is likely to be of the most benefit because they're in self-employment for all or most of their working lives, and because they are higher earning self-employed for whom the state pension is not likely to be adequate in retirement. In terms of low liquid savings, I think our research has highlighted that there are some potential pitfalls with automatic enrolment, keeping in pension saving those with relatively low financial resources who might be in financial difficulties. So we think there is some merit in thinking about whether automatic enrolment could be adjusted in some ways to improve the situation there. It's obviously very difficult because the whole success of automatic enrolment is built on this nudge, this default behaviour. So we can't just really advertise, actually, you can opt out. Don't worry, you can opt out, because we don't want to undo the success of the policy for the majority of the people that it is helping. It's being clever about thinking about ways of maybe we can make that message more salient for people in particular circumstances. So as ever, I think there's a need for more evidence in a lot of these areas. And I hope you'll be pleased to know that IFS is doing some work in some of these areas already, and we have hopes to do more to provide some important evidence in this context. In particular, we have a project ongoing already, funded by the Nuffield Foundation, looking at when and why individuals change their pension contributions over their lifetime amongst employees and particularly amongst the self-employed, and see if there's if we understand more about people's behaviour, maybe there are some lessons we can learn for that. For future automatic enrolment policy or future policy targeted at self-employed. We would also like to do some work really trying to understand the drivers and consequences of low liquid savings. It's a really important, really interesting issue. It's not just a simple story about not having enough income. You see low liquid savings quite a long way up the income distribution, actually. So really understanding what's going on there and the implications for a policy that's trying to encourage pension saving at the same time, I think is really important. And in terms of the new pension flexibilities, there's a really important issue at the moment, given the pandemic and the recent stock market volatility, about how people that have entered drawdown since the introduction of these flexibilities, how they've been affected by that volatility, by those asset price changes, and how they've responded to that. Because I think one of the perhaps under the radar changes that this reform has brought about is that, yes, it's given people lots more flexibility and lots more choice, but it's also given them more responsibility, and it's exposed them to a lot more risk. And this current crisis has probably really highlighted for a lot of people the risks that they're now facing and the risks that they've taken on. Whether they understand that and how they've responded to that, I think is really important for us to understand how people are going to be affected by this policy and how they can be supported to make the best decisions going forwards. And in the longer run sense, I think understanding more about how annuitized people are with the different kind of resources that they hold, and how that marries up with how they're spending, how they would like their spending to change through retirement, is a really important issue as well that we perhaps know less about than we would like to. So that's all I wanted to summarise on our research. If you do have any questions, please fire them into Slido, and I shall return after our expert panel have given us their perspectives, and we can bring up some of those questions in discussion. But for now, I'll hand straight over to Carolyn Jones to give us her perspective.
Thanks, Rowena. Yeah, and similarly, any questions for me, just please pop them in and we'll return to them later. I think for MAPS, the challenges of overcoming inertia and addressing attitudes to pensions is huge, and it's a big challenge for our national strategy and achieving our national goals. So it's really great to see this latest research from IFS, because it helps us consider the areas we need to focus on and for supporting people and ways we might be able to help address those attitudes to pensions. So really, really good to be involved in this research. I think a few areas stood out for me. So particularly interesting is that automatic enrolment has been so successful across all age groups and across all financial circumstances, and that's brilliant. And Rowena pointed out the drawbacks for those who may be struggling and it may not be the best option. Has auto enrolment been too successful? But if you look at that finding in relation to the confidence in adequacy, and people, 50% of people not feeling confident about the adequacy of their retirement plans, it really just shows the gap between the inertia of joining and then people engaging with their pensions. And it's a perennial problem in pensions, isn't it? How to get people engaged. And our recent research showed that over 50s tend to plan their retirement sort of a couple of years in advance or not at all. So over a quarter of people just leave retirement planning and those adequacy questions till quite late in the day when they can do less about it. So I think that's a key challenge, getting those enabling people to ask the right questions about adequacy and give them the answers and support them getting the answers. I thought the really interesting area, and one we've never come across before, or I've never seen looked at before, is sort of the interaction between housing and saving into a pension. At MAPS, we talk quite a lot about the hierarchy of saving and how we help people understand what to save for and when they have capacity to save. And I think the housing one is quite interesting, that auto enrolment is successful and pension money isn't being diverted into saving for house, which I think is a good thing given the age that people on average are buying houses now. That will be a massive gap if people were diverting pension money into housing. So as a pensions geek, that's really good. But at the other end of the spectrum, those people paying off their mortgage, we quite often get questions at MAPS about, should I overpay my mortgage or should I pay into my pension? And at least people are thinking about it. But I think there's an emotional connection to housing and an emotional connection to paying off your mortgage that doesn't necessarily lend itself to people thinking about paying it into a pension. I think the other thing we haven't really addressed is the shift post-pension freedoms, that post-retirement your money's staying invested for a lot of people who don't buy an annuity for a lot longer. So the value of carrying on paying into your pension in your 50s and early 60s is a lot more than it was, and I don't think that's something we need to work on getting people to understand, because I think they think of their retirement age and think, well, it's only X years away, it's not worth it. They're not thinking of the investment beyond. So I found that really interesting, and something to take forward. And then I thought the key one that struck home with what we're experiencing at MAPS with the pandemic was the finding that people are reporting that they're going to plan to retire later. And it would be really interesting to understand the reasons for that. So our research is saying post-COVID, some people are thinking of retiring later, and that might be about flexibility of working, and they don't have to get on a train or in a car anymore and feel they can work longer. And some are retiring earlier, and that's out of they're being made redundant or economic circumstances. So I really do wonder, is it a desire to work longer, or perhaps a recognition that it's a necessity to work longer? And if it is a necessity, if it's because people feel they must work longer to have an adequate income, then I do wonder what that means for those who are forced to retire earlier, and that we're seeing a lot of that now with people being made redundant. And in light of the significant impact of COVID on people in their 50s and 60s, I think what this research shows is it's especially important that people understand how things impact their retirement plans, and understand what is adequate for retirement and what might happen to that in extreme circumstances. And I think COVID has shone a light on that. And just to finish, some of the things we're seeing in people contacting MAPS is really reflecting some of this research. So we're seeing a lot more people are coming to us for help than were, but as you'd expect, it's people being made unexpectedly redundant in their 50s and 60s, people thinking about accessing their pension earlier than previously, and really grappling to understand what their options are given the shock that they've had. But not to finish on a downer, I think sort of the last thing that gives me hope is what we have seen throughout COVID and sustained since March is a significant increase in people contacting us about how they trace lost pensions and pension planning. So that gives me hope that perhaps this is a pivotal moment, and we've got people to engage with a little bit more than we previously have with thinking about their future. So and that I will leave it and hand over to Andrew.
Great, thanks, Carolyn. Also, big thanks to IFS for arranging today's event. There were 3 areas I just wanted to briefly add some comments around. So auto-enrollment, pensions for the self-employed, and then finally on the retirement market. So starting with auto-enrollment, it's clear auto-enrollment has been a resounding success. Participation is very high. The opt-outs, which we feared might happen, particularly amongst lower earners, just simply hasn't happened. The current COVID pandemic could affect that, so there's going to be more financially vulnerable people. We could see an increase in opt-outs as a result. As we look more into the future, another key indicator of the success of auto-enrollment is the level of retirement income which is generated and whether that meets people's expectations or not. There's probably a general agreement that for many people, 8% of band earnings isn't enough to provide a high level of replacement income. But given the financial impact that both COVID and Brexit are likely to have on the UK economy, that the next few years might not be an ideal time to ask employers to pay more money into pensions. The second area is around self-employed, and I thought it was quite shocking to see the massive decline in savings by self-employed over the last 20 years or so. It's difficult to understand all the reasons for that lack of saving, especially, Rowena mentioned particularly longer term, higher earning self-employed people are still not saving, and that's an area we probably need to analyse a bit more. That lack of savings is likely to mean many more self-employed will have to work later in life. And when they do retire, they'll be relying on state pensions primarily, and that means they are less likely to get the income, the retirement income that they desire. So it's very much an area of pension policy which needs attention to try and help solve this conundrum. The final point that I wanted to talk about, which is perhaps less been talked about today, is the retirement market. So it's clear society is changing. The last 15 years have seen big shifts in how people prepare for and enjoy their retirement. And in 15 years from now, the number of over 60s will have grown by about a third to about 20 million. It's clear people's needs are changing, some of these driven by legislation. So we've seen many legislative changes over recent years with pension freedoms and changes to state pensions. But as well as legislation, we've seen changing social, cultural and economic trends going on. So that range of trends has transformed how we spend our time in later life. And the most fundamental one probably has been the increased life expectancy and the potential for longer periods in retirement. And that's driven obviously the changes to state pensions. So state pensions has just equalised for men and women at 66. It's going up to 67 by 2028. And further changes beyond that are very likely. But it's also important for us to remember and appreciate that not all this additional time in retirement is healthy. So for the average 65-year-old, about half of the remaining years will be in some form of ill health. At the same time as that duration and the quality of our time in later life changes, so too do our spending desires and priorities. And the IFS research has shown a trend for more people working later in life. And I think the point Caroline made about whether that's through choice or through feeling you have to is a very fair point, and I think there'll be a mix of that. So currently the largest source of income for the richest retired people is occupational pensions. But for those reaching retirement in the next 10, 15, 20 years, they will have less defined benefit income. And we know that generally speaking, defined contribution pensions, while they've grown significantly because of auto enrollment, that they are generally less generous than DB income. And state pensions, as mentioned, are going up. So we'll see both state pension and final salary pensions will contribute a lower level of retirement income in future. And so this trend of more people working later in life is likely to continue and to grow. The pension freedoms have undoubtedly given people much more flexibility around how they access their retirement benefits. But we do have this mismatch between auto-enrollment where there's no engagement needed, but when people get to retirement, we want them to get involved and make decisions and hopefully informed decisions. That's kind of what we're all aiming to achieve. Flexible solutions are obviously key to try and help people deal with their circumstances as they change through what can be quite a long retirement. But the final point, I think, to me, I also believe that we need to help people consider using multiple different retirement options. So at the moment, the vast majority of people are using one strategy, whether that's withdrawing cash from their pension, going into drawdown, or buying an annuity. But using a combination of these solutions might help people achieve better outcomes. So, for example, using an annuity to guarantee essential expenditure alongside state benefits and then putting any excess in drawdown as kind of a rainy day pot, or using drawdown early in retirement and then gradually de-risking as people get older. So while pension freedoms have been hugely popular and have in the main worked very, very well, I believe there's more we can do to help people make the best decisions as they reach retirement. So that was it from me. I'm going to pass over to Carol Emerson from the IFS now. Thanks very much for your time. I look forward to the questions and comments shortly.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So stepping back, I want to talk a little bit about the state and private pension system and the journey we've been on. And if we go back kind of 10 years or so, I think we would say that the state pension system and the private pension system were actually in many ways much more complicated. There's been a lot of simplification achieved over the last 15 years or so. State pension system for those reaching retirement is clearly now much more simple. Essentially, it's a flat rate for those reaching a single state pension age with indexation thereafter. So clearly people can grumble about some of the details there, but it's clear to understand. And it's clearly also very salient. The work that Rowena talked about, people are understanding, or some people at least in their 40s are understanding that the state pension age is rising. And the private pension system is also in some ways much more simple. We have a individually arranged defined contribution system for most private sector workers. And for employees, we're relying on automatic enrolment to do a lot of the work. But a simple system doesn't mean that the situation that individuals face is very simple. There's still lots of risks there. There's still lots of challenges for them in trying to make the right set of retirement savings decisions. So I think that's where much of the complexity is here, is really about how hard it is for individuals to make the right decisions, to make the right choices, to take advantages of all the flexibility and choices available in the system to benefit themselves. So what Rowena talked about is some ideas for things where we could improve how that's working. So for example, we could see if people who are, say, a year off ending their mortgage, whether they'd like to commit in advance to putting, say, half of that saving into a pension. I think there's good psychological reasons to think that many people might commit at that point to more than what they might end up doing if they're just left to their own devices. Again, you're changing the default in advance. You're using that power that automatic enrolment takes advantage of. The Pensions Minister talked about automatic enrolment 2.0. When people talk about changing automatic enrolment, they're generally talking about how to get more people in, saving more. I think there's a lot of reasons to want to do that, but the research that Rowena set out suggests that actually we might want to be a little bit cautious about those who are brought into pensions inappropriately. So maybe we do want a situation where some people are given the idea of perhaps opting out temporarily. So for example, if you're behind on your council tax bill, perhaps you could receive a letter suggesting an opt-out for a year. So you'd automatically be enrolled after a year. That might help the situation. And of course, if you are able to achieve a world where even more of those brought into pensions under automatic enrolment are those who should be saving in a pension at that point in time, there then become a stronger case for going further with automatic enrolment. So for example, widening the age range and applying the contribution rates to all earnings, not band earnings. They're two proposals that the government set out in previous parliaments. They're sort of things that you could do going forward. So I think there is a strong case for those. People also often talk about increasing the contribution rates. And I think, again, if you've got the right people in pensions, you can question whether 8% of band earnings is enough and whether doing as a share of all earnings and perhaps having a higher percentage would be appropriate. But there, I think there needs to be careful thinking about, should it be a higher percentage for all, or should we make it vary, for example, by earnings or even by other characteristics like age? You don't have to do a uniform increase for everybody. And as Rowena stressed, when we're talking about automatic enrolment, we've got to remember that that policy at the moment, at least, is only affecting employees. It's not affecting the growing number of people who are working in self-employment. And there it is difficult to try and think of what levers you could pull to get the kind of lessons from automatic enrolment, to get the strengths of that policy applying to that population. But here's one that you might be able to do. We know that many people working in self-employment used to be employees. So maybe what you'd like to do is have a system where if you're an employee, you're making contributions to your pension through automatic enrolment. Should you suddenly leave that employment to become self-employment, at the moment, the default is you stop saving in that pension. Maybe we'd like to set up an advance so that the default is you continue to make what were your employee contributions to that new pension. Now, clearly, that's not going to tackle the group of long-running self-employed people, or at least it won't make much effect there for some time, but it could still at the margins make a difference and improve things in some ways. And finally, as Rowena alluded to at the end, there are also some more fundamental questions here. This system we have now in the UK, the state and private pension system, is very simple. It gives people lots of choices, lots of flexibilities, but that means that individuals really do have to manage a lot of risks. So I think where we need more research, more learning, but also perhaps more policy making, is to think about, well, how much risk are people facing in different groups? How well placed are they to manage those risks? Where can they take advantages of those freedoms and choices that the system gives them? And where are the groups who perhaps we have more concerns that they're less able to manage that system and therefore need more help, more support of ways of managing the risks and reducing their exposure to them? That's all for me. I'll now hand over to Paul and the Q&A session.
Well, thank you all. Thank you, Carl, Andrew, Carolyn, and Rowena for those fantastic contributions. We've only got 15 minutes or so. Do keep questions coming in, though we've got a fair few here. I'm only going to ask one of you to respond to each question, otherwise we'll not get through very many at all. And there's a couple here I think are really aimed at you, Carolyn. They're separate questions, but I'll ask them to you, both to you now. One is whether you've got any sense of how quickly government can achieve its new norm of pension-wise guidance among savers, and the other, which is specifically for you, is a question about whether auto-enrolment suggests that people should be taken to pension-wise automatically with an option to defer. So your response to those two would be great.
We need Guy still here to say how quickly they can get the regulations through. So pension-wise appointments. So DWP and FCA are looking at how to implement stronger nudge. So I won't second guess what they're going to do. We're operationally ready to do that. So we want more people to come to pension-wise when they're accessing their pension. What we do need to ensure pension-wise is really successful, and people who take a pension-wise at the right point in time really value the service, and our evaluation reports show that they come out more confident and feel that they can make better decisions. So it's absolutely valuable service for people accessing their pension. So what we need to ensure is that people that get to us still value that service. So I think the government have to think carefully about the design, that it doesn't detract from the value people get, and that it gets to people at the right time. The other thing we need to do with pension-wise covers the freedoms, and it covers them very well. So people come to us and we talk through the 6 options, and everyone gets the same appointment, and we go through the options, the risk of scams, but it is very focused on DC. We don't cover DB, and we don't cover sort of wider later life planning issues. And I think that's also where we need to be looking at maps in terms of what guidance do people need, and making sure people have the right guidance at the right time. So the needs of one 50-year-old might be pension-wise, it might not be. 50-year-olds might still have 16 years in the workforce and might need quite a different conversation to somebody who's about to take their pension. So we're very conscious that we need to make sure that people have the right guidance, whether it's TPAS type guidance, where it's a lot more dynamic and flexed to fit somebody's particular queries, or whether it's the specific pension-wise appointment. I don't know if that fully addresses the timescales, but I will leave that to the DWP to answer.
Great, thank you. And yes, I think, as you say, the timescale is very much not in your hands.
No.
Andrew, I don't know if you can answer this. There's a question here about whether the lifetime ISA, the LISA has had any impact on private pension savings. Is that something that you've seen at all?
We've not really seen any particular impact, I have to say. It's probably quite early days for trends to have emerged, but certainly from our perspective, we've not really seen any particular impact on levels of saving or differences in saving. So perhaps something that might emerge over time, but certainly so far nothing in particular.
How popular a product is the LISA?
Again, I don't think hugely from my experience. I don't think the take-up's been particularly high. But again, that might vary over time, and it might grow over time.
Great, Carl. One for you. Sort of on the LISA theme. I think nice big question here. Has the time come to stop tinkering and just abolish pensions altogether and switch all savings incentives to ISAs?
Well, I guess in first principle terms, there's very good reasons to have a pension system like we have at the moment, broadly speaking, where people make contributions from their income before any tax is applied. And then when they get to retirement, they pay tax on the income when they receive it at that point. There's good reasons to have a system based on that principle, allowing people to smooth their income over their lives and therefore smooth their tax payments over their lives. That said, we've had a period of lots and lots and lots of tinkering with the taxation of pensions. So I think it'd be better to leave it alone or do a fundamental review and then leave it alone. I don't like the idea that we keep changing it, keep chipping away, adding complexity. And if it is the case that we're completely unable to stop fiddling with the current system, it might be better to go all the way and have something more like an ISA-based system. But as I say, I think the first best would be to stop messing around with the system we have and keep it broadly as it is. And if we want to make the system less generous, to look at some of the things like the way the national insurance system works with pensions, where there is a very, very generous treatment.
I mean, do you think, Carl, the fact that in the future clearly most pension saving is going to be through DC pensions, which you don't have to, and indeed very few people will annuitize. And in that world, doesn't the ISA style of taxation just look enormously more simple, at least, where you pay the tax up front and then you pick it out when you want tax-free? Has the argument shifted as we move away from annuitisation?
It's certainly simple in the sense that you've got your pot of money then and you can draw on it when you like and there's no tax to pay. Of course, by telling people you will pay tax as you withdraw the money, we're kind of encouraging people to draw it in a smoother way, which we might think is appropriate. We might not like the fact that people can take all of their money out. If people could take all of the money out of the pot and pay no tax, we might worry about that. We might like the encouragement to get people to take it out gradually. I think we probably shouldn't ignore the fact that the vast, vast majority of public sector workers are still in defined benefit pensions, where charging them tax on their contributions up front so that they could have the pension tax-free is much easier said than done. If you take a teacher who's perhaps been in her career for 20 years, who's going to get promoted to a head teacher at a later point, you don't know her average salary. You really don't know the value of that pension pot at that moment or how it's accruing. So it's a complicated thing to do.
Yeah, I agree. To do that for DB would be extraordinarily hard. Rowena, there's a question here about auto enrolment. I mean, we know that most people putting us in, it's really a very small amount. And of course, interest rates are now extraordinarily low. So the question is, I mean, does the small amount people are saving under auto enrolment actually make any real financial sense?
Well, it's true that if you're saving a relatively small amount, you'll get a relatively small amount out at the end of it. I think the important question is whether you would rather have a small amount extra now or in the future, because on the same token, you're giving up a relatively small amount now to put it away. So in a way, it might still be that, if every little helps, that bit on top of your state pension in retirement might still be more valuable to you than the extra little bit you're giving up out of your take-home pay now.
Great. Well, why don't we finish with a question here, which I will ask all of you. So the actual question is, will future wealth taxes on pension rates reduce security of pensions, particularly for the young? But I suppose I'd like to broaden that out to a question about, how worried you are about the, and it's something we've kind of, Carl's referring to in terms of the taxation, how worried you are about the lack of stability in pension policy, and the risk associated with that, and whether there's anything you think we can do to give people more confidence in stability of that policy. And Andrew, do you want to start on that?
Yeah, I think so. Is it a worry? Yes, it is, because it's a continual. Every single budget there's continual rumors about changes. We do see lots of changes taking place, which is not ideal. I think to do any fundamental shift would have to take great care that, so it's easy to talk about a big shift, but we have to make care that there's no unintended consequences of that. So if we do something dramatic, it doesn't decreases in savings, for example. So how to stop tweaking to rules is very, very difficult, because obviously as circumstances change, Treasury see us as in some ways a bit of a cash cow that potentially they can look to manipulate. Taking some of the decisions outside the political sphere and setting up an independent pensions commission has been talked about, and that might be one way to get a little bit more stability. I'm not convinced the Treasury would ever go for that.
You may be right. Rowena?
So I think that the two things to be really careful of with wealth taxes are, first, that wealth isn't just money from heaven. For a lot of people, it's hard-earned savings that they've put away, and therefore you really need to understand, think through very carefully the motivations for taxing that wealth, and the implications of that for people in a variety of circumstances. And the other point that really interacts with that is that portfolio composition and the manner in which people hold wealth is really important, and you need to think about wealth in a collective sense, because people can very easily change their wealth between different forms, and the cost of taxing some form of wealth and not others is you can get massive shifts, and it really distorts incentives. But at the same time, you start taxing all of wealth, that really distorts people's decisions to save, and that's really important for life cycle issues like retirement saving. So if there are future wealth taxes or pension rates, I think the government needs to be extremely careful about the genuine justification that underlies those, not just we need to raise some money to deal with the outfall of the pandemic, but really what are you trying to do with those taxes and why, and what are all the likely knock-on consequences likely to be.
Carl?
Yeah, so I agree with Rowena. I think the proponents of a wealth tax need to be very, very clear about, is this something about unhappy about the current distribution of wealth, which I think points very much to a one-off measure, as opposed to a permanent tax each year hitting people who've got wealth again. And is it something which is about the super wealthy, which might be quite hard to tax, but maybe that's the group they're talking about? Or is it something about perhaps the middle classes, upper middle classes, where you're really talking about having to tax both pensions and housing, because that's where the bulk of their wealth is. On the stability of the system, I guess the state pension system, I guess I've got high hopes that it will be relatively stable now, because we've got a fairly simple system. I think it'd be, to change it requires you to either change the state pension age or to change the level of the payment. There aren't really any other parameters in the system. So it's not like the old complicated state pension system where you could fiddle around with things that people didn't really understand and have quite big effects on the payments. So I think the state pension system is likely to be pretty stable now. On the private pension system, I think it's quite possible that a chancellor looking for revenue, perhaps in the light of COVID, chooses to do something on the pension side. I think there it's important that it is principled, well thought through. And also, I guess, given the nature of the question that's being asked here, also to think through who are you hitting and who are you not hitting. So if you do things like make pension saving less generous, that's clearly something that's going to hit the working age population and protect pensioners. And you might want to think that through very carefully when you think about who's suffered financially through the current crisis.
And last word to you, Carolyn. How big a worry is this sort of uncertainty and tinkering and changes to rules?
So I'll take it from the consumer perspective. So people who phone maps are confused, and understandably so, because we can talk theoretically about change, but what that looks like from a consumer's perspective is, at retirement, we're seeing on average in pension wise people with 3 to 4 pension pots plus the state pension. That's only going up. We have extremes within that. We have more and more people with 10 or 11 pots. So the fabled 11 jobs is coming to fruition for some people, but they're not necessarily big in volume. But when you think of the ecosystem those pots exist in, they might have a SIP, they might have a GPP, they might have a master trust pension, they might have some AVCs, they might have a DB occupational pension, all with different rules, different regulations, and different retirement options. So that's what the customer sees. And we do get people, when we talk to them about the reason for taking the tax-free cash, for example, saying it might be taken away. So there is a general fear, and that general fear is causing people to make decisions. I'm not saying they wouldn't make that decision without that, but it's a driver for decision. But also, they're already in a complex system. We have never had a pensions change that has made the pension system simpler. Despite what the government might call it, it never has been simplified. And we always get to a state where we're grandfathering. So if someone's got 4 pension pots and we get a new system, they go to 8 pension pots because they have 4 grandfathered pots and 4 new pots. So unless somebody's going to stand up and say, let's take it all away and start again, I can't really see that happening. We're just introducing more and more complexity from the consumer, and the engagement we've talked about through this, and people taking decisions and becoming engaged at retirement will not happen because we've just drowned them in the complexity.
Great, thank you. It's a shame the minister isn't here to
maybe I wouldn't have said it if he was.
last point, but I'm sure that there are some of his officials listening, and I'm sure they recognise that. But the importance of clarity and stability here is so great. Anyway, we have come indeed slightly beyond the end of our time, so thank you ever so much to my colleagues Carl and Rowena, and also especially to Andrew and Carolyn. Do watch this space. We've got lots more work going on in the pensions area. We're hoping that we can put together another consortium to carry on with some of this work and continue, as the Minister said, to be really focusing on some of the big policy issues facing us in pensions. So thank you everyone very much.